You turn on the TV. On the screen is the famous CNN anchor, a gray-haired man with a piercing gaze and an impeccable reputation. His name is Anderson Cooper. He earns $12 million a year telling you about wars and hurricanes. But few viewers wonder whose blood runs in his veins. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt. In one interview, Cooper uttered a phrase that would send a chill down the spine of any normal person. He said, "Mom made it clear to me right away that there was no trust fund." Think about these words. The heir to the richest family in the history of the United States of America works for a salary because there is simply no inheritance. It evaporated, disappeared, dissolved into thin air. To understand the scale of this catastrophe, we need to rewind the tape back. Not 100 years, but to 1973. Vanderbilt University in Nashville. The first family reunion. In the hall, 120 direct descendants of the dynasty gather. Lawyers, journalists, housewives.
They look at each other.
And silence hangs in the air. Statistics are inexorable. Among the 120 people gathered in this room, there is not a single millionaire. This seems impossible. It contradicts the laws of physics and economics, because their great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was not just rich, he owned the world. When he died in 1877, his fortune was estimated at $105 million. Today, this figure may seem modest, but let's translate it into the language of real purchasing power. Economists calculated Cornelius's fortune as a share of the US GDP at that time. If we apply this proportion to today, the dynasty founder's capital would amount to from $185 to $200 billion. This is more than Jeff Bezos has, more than Bill Gates. At the moment of Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, he had more money than was in the United States Treasury. If he wanted, he could have bought the entire government and rented out the White House. And so, just 48 years after his death, one of his direct heirs dies in a hotel room, without money even to pay the bill. How did this happen? Where did the money go that would have been enough to build an aircraft carrier fleet or buy a small European country? Usually, empires collapse due to wars, due to revolutions, due to confiscations. But no one robbed the Vanderbilts. Their houses weren't burned by the Bolsheviks. Their accounts weren't frozen by the Nazis. They did it themselves. This is not a story of creation. This is a story of the most grandiose, cynical, and insane destruction of capital in human history. We will see how mansions worth tens of millions of dollars were demolished by bulldozers because no one wanted to pay for heating. We will see how pearl necklaces worth an entire city block were sold for next to nothing in pawn shops. The symbol of this fall was the sound that rang out at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in New York in 1926.
It was the sound of a jackhammer.
Workers were smashing the facade of the largest private home ever built on Manhattan. 130 rooms, walls of French limestone, floors of Italian marble. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's house stood for less than 40 years. It was destroyed to build a department store where tourists today buy expensive bags. The dust into which this palace turned, that is the metaphor for the entire dynasty. They thought they were building for centuries. They commissioned family crests, though they were sons of a ferryman. They married off their daughters to dukes, buying titles like livestock at a fair. They threw balls where one dinner cost as much as an ordinary worker earned in 10 years of life. This is a story of how greed turned into madness, and madness into poverty. But before we see the fall, we need to look into the eyes of the man who started it all, the man who hated luxury as much as his grandchildren would adore it.
The man who couldn't write without mistakes, but could count every cent.
We are heading to the beginning of the 19th century, to the port of New York, to where a young guy with hard fists and a complete lack of conscience is preparing to take this world by the throat. Welcome to the story of the vanished billions. The story of $200 billion began with a loan of $100. That was the exact amount 16-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt borrowed from his mother, Phoebe Hand, on May 1, 1810. With this money, he didn't buy stocks or land. He bought a flat-bottomed boat, a pirogue, to ferry people and goods from Staten Island to Manhattan. His mother set a condition. The boy had to plow and sow a rocky field of 8 acres before he got the money. Cornelius did it. He always paid the price that fate demanded, but in return, he took everything without remainder. Cornelius Vanderbilt, whom the world will remember by the nickname Commodore, was not a gentleman.
He was a street fighter in an expensive frock coat. He was uneducated, rude, swore, and constantly chewed tobacco, spitting on the carpets. He wrote with monstrous grammatical errors. But he had a gift that couldn't be bought in any Ivy League university. The gift of seeing where the money lies, and a beastly grip to tear it from the throats of competitors. His strategy was simple and brutal: dumping. If a competitor charged 25 cents for the ride, Vanderbilt lowered the price to 10. If the competitor lowered to 10, Vanderbilt carried for free, earning on the sale of food and drinks on board. He strangled competitors, drove them to bankruptcy, and then bought their ships for pennies. By 40, he became the king of the water. His steamboats plowed the Hudson and the Atlantic. But the true genius of the Commodore manifested when he turned almost 70. At an age when most people write wills and warm their feet by the fireplace, Vanderbilt performed the craziest pirouette in business history. He sold his fleet. He betrayed the element that made him rich because he saw the future. And that future stood on iron rails. Vanderbilt began buying railroads. He united scattered branches into a single, powerful system, the New York Central. It was he who made trains arrive on schedule, not whenever the engineer felt like it. To understand his character, it's enough to recall one episode. When business partners tried to deceive him while he was on vacation in Europe, he didn't sue. He wrote them a short note. "Gentlemen, you tried to cheat me. I won't sue you because court is too long. I'll just ruin you." And he ruined them. At the same time, possessing a fortune exceeding the budgets of many countries, the Commodore himself lived remarkably modestly compared to what his descendants would arrange. His house on Washington Place, number 10, was solid, brick, but gloomy.
No Italian marble, no golden toilets. The furniture was upholstered in stiff horsehair, not velvet. He knew the price of money and hated wastefulness. His attitude toward the family was tyrannical. His wife, Sophia, who bore him 13 children, he once forcibly placed in a psychiatric hospital just because she dared to object to moving to New York. He pulled her out only after 3 months, when he needed her to sign papers for the sale of land. He despised his sons, considering them weaklings. His eldest son, William Henry, he called a blockhead and a fool, publicly humiliating him until he turned 40. The Commodore believed only in strength and control. In January of 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt lay on his deathbed. Doctors diagnosed him with a whole bouquet of diseases, from peritonitis to kidney failure. But even dying, he thought about preserving the empire.
His heirs gathered in his room, awaiting the division of the $100 million pie.
But the Commodore had one last surprise in store for them. He was obsessed with the idea that capital must remain indivisible. To divide the money meant to weaken the power. Therefore, he left 95% of the entire fortune, $90 million, to that very blockhead, William Henry. The other children received pitiful crumbs. The daughters got $500,000 each, a decent sum, but insulting compared to their brother's share. One of the sons, the epileptic Cornelius Jeremiah, committed suicide shortly after, never recovering from the shock and resentment. Dying, the Commodore was confident he had acted wisely. He created a financial monster and handed the leash to one pair of hands. He believed that such a concentration of resources would make the dynasty immortal. He overlooked only one thing.
William Henry, raised in the shadow of the tyrant, was thrifty. But William Henry had his own children, and those children never saw their grandfather steering the ferryboat under cold rain. They saw only mountains of gold that seemed endless. The Commodore built a foundation of granite, but he didn't know that his grandsons were already preparing dynamite to blow up that foundation for a fireworks display. The old pirate closed his eyes, and the era of creation ended. The era of consumption began. The Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, died on the 8th of December, 1885. He collapsed onto the carpet in his office during a business meeting. He was 64 years old. In those 8 years that he managed the empire after his father's death, he accomplished the impossible. He doubled the family's fortune. 100 million turned into 200. In terms of modern money, that's about $400 billion. William Henry was the ideal guardian of the treasury, a workaholic who hated publicity. But as soon as his body cooled, the dam holding back the flow of money collapsed. Power passed to the third generation, the Commodore's grandsons. And unlike their grandfather, they never plowed rocky fields. Unlike their father, they did not sit over accounting books all night long. They were born at the top of Olympus and sincerely believed that this view belonged to them by right of birth. The era arrived that Mark Twain would call, with biting irony, the Gilded Age. Not golden, but precisely gilded. A thin layer of shine over rotten wood. And the Vanderbilts became the chief architects of this decoration. Instead of multiplying capital, they started a competition that went down in history as the Mansion Race. It was a war of vanity, where the weapons were not cannons, but banquet halls and yachts. 2 grandsons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his brother William Kissam, divided the lion's share of the inheritance, over $60 million each, more than $1 billion today, in hand. The first thing they did was start spending. The culmination of this madness was the evening of March 26, 1883. The ball, organized by William Kissam's wife, the ambitious Alva Vanderbilt. This was not just a party. This was a military operation to capture New York's attention. Preparation took several weeks. The cost of this one evening amounted to $250,000. So you understand the scale. At that time, a qualified worker could buy a good house for $2,000. The Vanderbilts spent on dancing the cost of 125 houses. In terms of 2024 rates, one night cost about $7 million. Just on flowers, $11,000 were spent, $300,000 today. The hall was turned into a tropical forest. Guests were greeted by footmen in powdered wigs and velvet liveries, costumes that in democratic America looked like a spit in the face of the Republic. They copied the Versailles court of Louis XIV, forgetting how the French monarch ended. But the most shocking was not the champagne bill,
2,000 bottles for the night, but the outfits. Alva's daughter-in-law, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, appeared in a costume called Electric Light. This dress entered the textbooks of fashion history as a symbol of absolute excess. It was sewn from yellow satin and decorated with tinsel, but the main thing, in Alice's hand, was a torch, inside which a real electric light bulb on batteries was hidden. In 1883, electricity was a high-tech wonder. Using it as a dress accessory is like coming to a party today with a nuclear reactor in your purse. This gesture screamed, "We conquered not only money, we conquered physics." The menu of that evening reads like a death sentence for the liver. Turtle soup from the rarest reptiles, canvasback ducks that were valued by the weight of gold, lobsters under complex sauces. Food ceased to be fuel. It became an art of demonstration. It was precisely in this period that the Vanderbilts began building their famous summer cottages in Newport. The word cottage here is a mockery. These were palaces. Each grandson had his own yacht. The yacht Alva, named after William's wife, was 87 meters long, the largest private yacht in the world at that time. It had a piano, a marble fireplace, and a crew of 50 sailors whose sole task was to ensure the owners always had fresh ice for cocktails. But behind this shine lurked emptiness. The Gilded Age was an era of monstrous inequality. While the Vanderbilts spent millions on costume balls, a couple of miles from their palaces, in the slums of the Lower East Side, children died of typhoid because their parents had no money for clean water. The Vanderbilts didn't notice it.
They lived in a hermetic bubble. They created their own reality, where the only problem was the question, whose diamond is larger? This was the first generation that forgot the Commodore's commandment. Money is a tool of power, not a toy. They began to treat capital as an infinite resource. It seemed to them that $200 million couldn't be spent. They were wrong. Mathematics is a cruel science, and it had already begun the countdown. But before the numbers turned red, the Vanderbilts had one more war to win. The war for recognition. Because despite all their millions, the doors of New York's most elite homes were closed to them. Old money looked at them as vulgar upstarts. And the Vanderbilts decided to buy their ticket into high society, even if it meant sacrificing their own children. In late 19th century New York, there were two governments. One sat in Washington and passed laws. The second sat in the parlors of Fifth Avenue and decided who had the right to exist. And the second government was far more ruthless. It was headed by one woman, Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor. In the press, she was simply called Mrs. Astor. She needed no name or clarifications. If you said Mrs. Astor, everyone knew who you meant. This woman, clad in black velvet and diamonds, was the sole dictator of high society. Her power rested on a list called the 400. Exactly that many people fit in her ballroom. If your name wasn't on this list, you were nobody. You could possess millions, but to Mrs. Astor, you remained invisible. And the Vanderbilts were not on this list. To the old aristocracy, descendants of the first Dutch settlers, the Vanderbilts were vulgar upstarts. Knickerbockers, that's what the representatives of the old families called themselves, remembered that the Commodore was an uneducated boatman who blew his nose into the curtains. Their money smelled of sweat and machine oil, while in Mrs. Astor's world, money was supposed to smell of old dust and rent. For years, the Vanderbilts tried to break into this closed club, but every time they ran into a wall of icy silence. They weren't invited to dinners.
They weren't bowed to at the opera. They were ignored with a politeness that hurts more than a slap. Then Alva Vanderbilt took matters into her own hands. The wife of the Commodore's grandson understood. If the door is locked, you need to buy a battering ram and smash it along with the hinges. That battering ram became architecture. Alva decided to build a house that would make old money look poor. She hired architect Richard Morris Hunt and ordered him to build a castle in the French Renaissance style at 660 Fifth Avenue. This was a challenge. At that time, wealthy New Yorkers lived in uniform brown townhouses, brownstones. Alva built a palace of white limestone that shone in the sun like a precious stone. Petit Chateau became a slap to public taste, and at the same time, a magnet from which it was impossible to tear one's gaze. But walls alone were not victory. Alva needed a strategic maneuver, and she played a game worthy of Machiavelli. The occasion was that very legendary ball of 1883 we spoke about. The whole city buzzed in anticipation. Daughters of the most noble families prepared special dance numbers. One of them was young Carrie Astor, the daughter of that very impregnable Mrs. Astor. Carrie, along with her friends, rehearsed a complex dance called the Star Quadrille. And so, a few days before the ball, Alva struck. She spread a rumor, then officially confirmed. Unfortunately, young Miss Astor would not be able to attend the ball. The reason was formal and murderously polite. According to the etiquette of that time, the hostess of the house could not invite a girl whose mother had never paid a courtesy visit to that house.
"I would gladly invite Miss Astor," Alva said, shrugging her shoulders. "But Mrs. Astor has never left her calling card for me. We are, essentially, unacquainted." This was checkmate. Young Carrie sobbed. She had been preparing for this ball for months. For her, missing this event was social death. A tragedy unfolded at home. The daughter begged her mother to swallow her pride. Mrs. Astor had no choice. She realized that the Vanderbilts had become too big to ignore. They had taken her daughter's happiness hostage. And so, on one cold spring day, Mrs. Astor's carriage stopped at the doors of the Vanderbilts' castle. A footman in a blue livery descended the steps. He held a silver tray in his hands. Onto the tray was placed a small cardboard card engraved with Mrs. Astor. This tiny piece of cardboard weighed more than all the gold in the Vanderbilts' vaults. It was an act of capitulation. The next day, Alva sent an invitation to Carrie Astor, and at the ball itself, Mrs. Astor appeared in person, thereby acknowledging the victory of new money. The Vanderbilts won. They became the kings of New York. But this victory became the beginning of their end. Because the social war was replaced by an arms race in the realm of luxury. Having received the Astors' approval, the Vanderbilts decided that now everything was permitted to them. They began building houses not for living, but for displaying status. They fell into the trap that they themselves had created. To remain at the top of the pyramid, headed by Mrs. Astor, they had to spend more and more. One palace replaced another. One yacht seemed too small compared to the neighbor's yacht. Having won the social war, they lost the war with common sense. They began spending capital not on assets, but on showing off. And the most terrible thing, they began trading their children to cement this success on an international level. The next chapter of their history would be written not in New York, but in the old, cold cathedrals of Europe, where love would be exchanged for a coat of arms and a human life valued in pounds sterling. At the end of the 19th century, America began exporting a new kind of commodity to Europe. It was not cotton, not steel, and not grain. It was living people. History remembers them as dollar princesses. It sounds like the title of a Disney fairy tale, but in reality,
It was one of the most cynical trade operations in human history. The scheme was simple to the point of disgust. On one side of the Atlantic sat British aristocrats. They had resounding titles, castles with 1,000 years of history, and family crests rooted in the times of the Crusades. But they had one problem. They were bankrupt. Their estates were falling apart, roofs were leaking, and land taxes were strangling the remnants of their fortunes. On the other side sat the Vanderbilts. They had so much money that they could burn it in fireplaces, but they lacked blue blood. In the eyes of the European elite, they remained grandsons of a ferryman. And then the market found a solution: money in exchange for a title. The chief architect of the most high-profile deal of this era was again Alva Vanderbilt. Having conquered New York, she targeted Britain. She didn't need just a husband for her daughter, she needed the highest title that money could buy. Her choice fell on Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was the owner of Blenheim Palace, the only non-royal house in England with the right to be called a palace. But Charles was as poor as a church mouse by the standards of his status. He urgently needed roof and heating repairs. The victim in this deal was Alva's daughter. Young, beautiful, and utterly unhappy Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo didn't want to be a duchess. She was secretly engaged to the American Winthrop Rutherford. It was true love, the kind written about in novels. But when Alva found out, she turned into a jailer. The mother locked her 18-year-old daughter in her room in the Newport mansion. Consuelo was forbidden to go out, write letters, or see friends. But the girl resisted. Then Alva played her last card. She announced that she was dying of a heart attack caused by her daughter's disobedience. The doctors, of course, were in cahoots, or simply intimidated. Alva issued an ultimatum. Either you marry the Duke, or I die, and my death will be on your conscience. The psychological abuse worked. The broken Consuelo agreed. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, in St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue. This was an event of planetary scale. A crowd of several thousand gathered on the street. Police struggled to hold back the crush of onlookers. Newspapers devoted their front pages to this event. But inside the church, the atmosphere was not of celebration, but of a funeral. Consuelo was 20 minutes late to the altar. Not because she was stuck in traffic, but because in the bride's room she sobbed so hard that the makeup artists couldn't hide the red spots on her face. She had to apply a thick layer of powder and lower her veil so that no one would see her swollen eyes. As she walked to the altar, she did not look at the groom. She looked into the void. And what about the Duke? He got what he came for. The marriage contract was drawn up with the precision of a bank agreement. Consuelo's dowry amounted to $2.5 million in New York Central Railroad stock. In terms of modern money, that's about $80 or $90 million, plus an annual allowance of $100,000 for life. In fact, the Vanderbilts bought the Duke of Marlborough. Charles didn't even hide it. Later, he admitted that he married only to save Blenheim Palace. And he did save it.
Vanderbilt money went toward restoring the halls, buying paintings, and updating the park. The irony of fate. Today, tourists visiting Blenheim admire its grandeur, unaware that every brick there was paid for with the tears of an American girl sold by her own mother. This marriage, of course, became a disaster. They were unhappy from the first day. Consuelo bore the Duke 2 sons, the heir and the spare, as they cynically joked at court. Having fulfilled her biological and financial duty, she and the Duke began living separately, and then divorced altogether, which was an unheard-of scandal for that time.
Consuelo's wedding became the peak of the Vanderbilts' power. They proved that for their money, even the history of England could be bought. It seemed to them that they had achieved divine status. But it was precisely at this moment, as wedding marches played, that emptiness began to grow inside the family. Huge houses demanded huge sacrifices. And the next hero of our story would not be a person, but a house. The largest, most expensive, and loneliest house in America, which would drain the life from its inhabitants faster than any vampire. We are heading to the Biltmore estate. While Alva was storming New York and Consuelo was crying in a British palace, another grandson of the Commodore, George Washington Vanderbilt II, decided to build something that would forever change the notion of home. George was the black sheep of the family, an intellectual, introvert, a man who preferred books to people. He felt cramped in noisy New York. He wanted seclusion, and for his seclusion, he chose the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. What he built there defies logical comprehension. The Biltmore estate. This is not just the largest private home in American history. It is a monument to human ego cast in limestone. 175,000 square feet, 4 acres of living space under one roof, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces. To deliver materials to this wilderness, George had to build his own railroad 5 kilometers long. Thousands of workers toiled for 6 years, turning wild forest into a French chateau. Let's step inside. Imagine you are standing in the banquet hall. The ceiling rises 7 stories high. At the far end of the room is a triple fireplace so huge that a modern school bus could park inside it. Above the table hangs a chandelier weighing 3/4 of a ton. When George sat down to dine, even if he had guests, he seemed like an ant in this stone cathedral. The hall's acoustics were such that the clink of a fork against a plate echoed, underscoring the absolute ringing silence. Biltmore was equipped with technologies that seemed like magic in 1895. Electricity, central heating, electric elevators, internal telephone system, fire suppression system. At a time when most Americans went to the outhouse and lit their homes with kerosene lamps, Vanderbilt lived in a time machine from the future. But this house was a monster that required constant feeding. For Biltmore to function, an army was needed. About 40 servants worked inside the house. Outside, in the gardens and on the farm, hundreds more. The life of the staff in the Vanderbilt's houses is a story in itself. They were an invisible caste. Architects designed the houses so that servants could move through secret corridors and staircases without catching the owner's eyes. A maid had to become invisible. If she accidentally bumped into the master in the hallway, she was obliged to turn to the wall and freeze until he passed. Their work was absurd in its detail. Footmen at Biltmore had to change liveries several times a day. Morning uniform, daytime, evening formal. Newspapers for the master were ironed with a flat iron before serving. Not for disinfection, but so the printing ink would dry and not stain the gentleman's fingers. Coins given as tips were washed beforehand. The Vanderbilts created a world where any of their whims was fulfilled before they even realized it. But this comfort had a downside. The house began to own its master. George Vanderbilt spent most of his inheritance on building and furnishing Biltmore. He snapped up Cardinal Richelieu's tapestries, Persian carpets, Durer's engravings. He turned the house into a museum. But you can't live in museums. In them, you can only store exhibits. Biltmore was so enormous that there was no coziness in it. It was a golden cage, isolated from reality by thousands of hectares of forest. Guests who visited George often complained in letters that they felt oppressed there. The grandeur weighed on the psyche. This was the apotheosis of the architecture of power. But behind this grandeur lurked a financial black hole. Maintaining such an estate cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. These were money thrown into the furnace of 65 fireplaces. George thought his capital was endless. He was wrong. It was precisely in these cold, endless halls that what would destroy the dynasty faster than spending began to take root. Boredom, detachment from the world, a sense of impunity. When you have everything, you have nothing to strive for. When any of your whim is fulfilled by an invisible army of servants, you lose touch with reality. The next generation of Vanderbilts would no longer build, it would destroy. Not walls, but their own lives. We move to the darkest chapter of the history, to the moment when the brilliant facade cracked and rot began to crawl out. Alcohol, drugs, suicides, and scandals that would make even the most cynical reporters of that time blush. The Gilded Age was ending. The time of reckoning was coming. From the outside, the Vanderbilt Empire looked indestructible. Their palaces of limestone and marble were built to last millennia. But if the architecture was antique, the morality inside these walls began to rapidly decay. Money acts like a magnifying glass. If you are smart, money will make you a genius. If you are vicious, money will turn you into a monster. What doomed the Vanderbilts was that the fourth generation of heirs had no purpose left. They didn't need to work. They didn't need to study. Their surname opened any doors, and their checkbook closed any mouths. This impunity bred a new, terrible virus: total boredom. And boredom is the mother of all vices. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared as early as 1895, and it was made again by Alva Vanderbilt. She did the unthinkable. She filed for divorce from William Kissam. In the Victorian era, divorce was not just a scandal, it was a social nuclear bomb. People of their circle did not divorce. They lived in hatred, took mistresses, slept in different wings of their huge castles, but kept up appearances. Alva broke omerta. She publicly accused her husband of adultery. Newspapers savored the details. The myth of the divine family collapsed. It turned out that behind the walls of palaces reigned infidelity, lies, and cold calculation. But the divorce was just the flowers. The berries ripened when the Commodore's great-grandchildren grew up. The brightest example of rotting was Reginald "Reggie" Vanderbilt. You should remember this name because he is the father of Gloria and the grandfather of Anderson Cooper. Reginald was the archetype of a life burner. He inherited $15.5 million. In today's terms, about $350 million. A huge sum, but no longer what the grandfather had. The problem was that Reggie spent as if he had a printing press in the basement. His passions were cards, horses, and alcohol. He was a regular at underground casinos. In one night at the Green Bays, he could lose $70,000. That's the cost of 35 homes of ordinary Americans, squandered in a couple of hours amid the clink of crystal glasses. He wrote checks without looking at the account balance. But Reggie's main enemy was not poker, but the bottle. Vanderbilts of the Gilded Age drank a lot. Champagne for breakfast, wine for lunch, cognac for dinner. But Reggie turned it into a sport,
By 40, he looked like an old man. His face was puffy, eyes cloudy. Doctors gave him diagnoses usually hidden behind euphemisms like nervous exhaustion. But the truth was in the medical record: cirrhosis of the liver. On September 4th, 1925, Reginald Vanderbilt died at his Sandy Point estate. He was only 45 years old. He literally killed himself with his own money. After opening the will, the terrible truth emerged. Of his fortune, only ruins remained. Most of the money went to pay off gambling debts and creditors. His young widow and little daughter Gloria were left with a trust fund that was a pitiful shadow of former glory. Reggie's story was not an exception. It was an epidemic. The brother of Cornelius II committed suicide in a hotel, finding no meaning in life. Other heirs got involved in endless lawsuits against each other, contesting wills. The family turned into a school of piranhas devouring themselves. Lawyers grew rich, the fortune melted away. The Vanderbilts became heroes not of the financial chronicle, but of the society pages. Journalists wrote not about new railroads built by the family, but about who sleeps with whom and what they wore to the races. They lost the predator instinct that the Commodore had. The old pirate knew every nut and bolt in his locomotives. His great-grandchildren didn't even know the price of a ticket on their train. They became mere rentiers, parasitizing the body of the empire built by someone else. And while they amused themselves, the world around them was changing. Income tax was introduced, which hadn't existed before. The Great Depression loomed. The economy was becoming harsher, but the Vanderbilts kept dancing, convinced that the music would play forever. They didn't notice how they ended up on the edge of the abyss, and fate, as if mocking their carelessness, prepared a blow from which there was no buying off. A blow not from stock quotes, but from the icy waters of the North Atlantic. In the next part, we will see the point of no return, the moment when death came for one of the family's most brilliant representatives, and even all the gold in the world couldn't buy him a lifeboat. Fate has a dark sense of humor. Sometimes it gives a person a second chance, only to take their life with even greater cruelty. In April of 1912, 34-year-old Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, one of the family's richest and most popular members, was supposed to return from Europe to America. He had a ticket on the maiden voyage of the world's most luxurious liner. At the last moment, due to a whim of the weather or a business meeting, he canceled the trip. The liner was called Titanic. Alfred read about the ship's sinking in the morning newspapers, sitting in his London club. He thought he was born in a charmed shirt. He was wrong. Death had simply given him a 3-year reprieve. On May 7, 1915, Alfred stood on the deck of another giant, the Lusitania. This was a time when World War I had already engulfed the world. The German embassy published a warning in New York newspapers. Any ships under the British flag in waters around England were targets. The notice was printed right next to the Lusitania sailing advertisement. But first-class passengers laughed. Sink the Lusitania? Impossible. She was the hound of the ocean. She was too fast for German submarines. Besides, it was a civilian vessel, with women and children on board. Gentlemen don't wage war that way. The Vanderbilts were accustomed to rules being written for others. They believed their status served as an invisible force field. At 2:10 in the afternoon, when the liner was just a few miles from the Irish coast, the German submarine U-20 fired one torpedo. The impact was horrific. Then a second explosion followed. The coal dust detonated, or, according to other versions, a secret cargo of ammunition in the hold. The ship,
which was a floating palace, instantly listed to the starboard side. Hell began. Electricity went out. Elevators with people inside got stuck between floors. Lifeboats from the port side could not be lowered due to the list. Those from starboard smashed against the hull. It was precisely in these 18 minutes, exactly how long the Lusitania took to sink, that the true essence of Alfred Vanderbilt was revealed. He was the heir to tens of millions. He was accustomed to servants tying his shoelaces.
In any other situation, he could have bought a place in a lifeboat, bribed the sailors, used his name as a pass. But he did not do that. Survivors from the disaster later gave testimony. They saw Alfred on the boat deck. He was calm, as if at a reception in Newport. He wore a three-piece suit. Together with his valet, Ronald Denyer, he formed a human chain, helping women and children board the few surviving lifeboats. At that moment, a scene occurred that should enter history as the highest point of nobility and tragedy of this family. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt could not swim. He knew this. He looked at the black, icy water of the Atlantic and understood he had no chance. But when he saw a young woman with a child in her arms who had no life jacket, he removed his own. He did not just give away a piece of cork and canvas, he gave his life. He personally fastened the jacket on the woman, knowing that he was signing his own death warrant. "Find all the babies!" he shouted to his valet, as the deck slipped from under his feet. The ship went under bow first. Alfred Vanderbilt disappeared in the whirlpool. His body was never found. The ocean didn't care what his last name was. A fortune in millions of dollars, railroad stocks, titles, mansions, all of it proved useless against physics and cold water. Alfred's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was the point of no return for the entire dynasty. Alfred was one of the few in the third generation who had business acumen. He managed the family business. He kept his hand on the pulse. With his death, the helm of the empire was left unmanned. Power passed to people who were not ready for the storms of the 20th century. On that day, May 7th, 1915, the Vanderbilts lost not only a brother and a father, they lost confidence in tomorrow. The myth of their invulnerability was torpedoed. If the richest man on the ship can drown like a bum, it means money no longer protects. The family plunged into mourning, but this mourning was strange. Instead of uniting, they continued their race to the abyss. Alfred's death became a signal. Live for today, tomorrow may not come. And they began spending with double force, trying to drown the fear of the future in the clink of glasses. But the future was already at the doorstep, and it brought not torpedoes, but tax inspectors. Just 2 years after the Lusitania sank, the federal income tax was introduced in the US, which began devouring the fortunes of the rich. And then 1929 arrived, the Great Depression. For the Vanderbilts, whose assets were invested in real estate requiring colossal expenses and in stocks that devalued, this became the beginning of the end. The mathematical curse came into effect. We move to the stage of collapse. We will see how palaces whose construction cost millions will be sold at scrap metal prices. The Vanderbilt Empire was not destroyed by Bolsheviks or competitors. It was destroyed by boring, inexorable accounting. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was added to the US Constitution. It gave the government the right to levy income tax. To the Commodore, this would have seemed like daylight robbery. In his time, he paid zero. But by the 1920s, the tax rate for the super rich soared to the heavens, reaching 70% at peak moments. Suddenly, the terrible truth emerged. The Vanderbilts' palaces were not assets. They were liabilities. They were giant stone parasites sucking out money.
Imagine a mansion on Fifth Avenue. To simply keep it alive, tons of coal were needed for heating, hundreds of thousands of dollars in property tax, and an army of 30 servants who needed salaries. Previously, these expenses were covered by dividends from railroads. But railroads ceased to be a monopoly. Cars, trucks, airplanes appeared.
Profits fell, while costs to maintain the Versailles only grew. The Vanderbilts became hostages of their own luxury. The first to fall was the main citadel, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion on Fifth Avenue, number 1. That very house with 130 rooms. Cornelius's widow, Alice, the very one in the electric light costume, lived there alone. Imagine this picture. A tiny, elderly woman in an empty house designed for 1,000 guests. Around her, silence and dust. In 1926, she sold this house for $7 million. Sounds like a lot? No. This was the price of the land. The house itself, a masterpiece of architecture filled with carvings, marble, and history, was valued at $0. The developer who bought the plot had no intention of living there. He needed space for a department store. For a week, New York residents watched a surreal spectacle. Workers smashed fireplaces brought from Italy by sea with sledgehammers. Bulldozers crushed walls painted by Europe's best artists. In a few days, America's largest private home turned into a mountain of construction debris. It was simply erased from the face of the earth, as if it had never existed. This became the signal for mass flight. Heirs began frantically getting rid of real estate. The Idle Hour estate on Long Island was sold. The famous Marble House in Newport, which Alva built as a temple of feminism, was closed, and the furniture covered with white sheets. But the real blow came not from income taxes, but from inheritance tax. Every time another Vanderbilt died, the state took half of their fortune. To pay this tax, heirs had to sell assets. But to whom to sell a 200-room palace during the Great Depression? There were no buyers. The antiques market was flooded with Vanderbilt treasures. Auctions followed one after another. 15th-century tapestries sold for the price of hallway rugs. Pearl necklaces worth hundreds of thousands sold for next to nothing. Because in the 1930s, people needed bread, not pearls. The Vanderbilts faced a humiliating reality. Their things were worth more than they themselves were. In the mid-20th century, the final act of the drama occurred. Suffolk County announced it was seizing William K. Vanderbilt II's Eagle's Nest estate for unpaid taxes. Other houses were transferred to colleges or turned into museums simply because the heirs could not pay the electricity bills. The famous Biltmore, that very house of George's in the mountains, survived only because the descendants decided to open it to tourists. In 1930, they first let the public inside to earn money for maintaining the roof. Aristocrats turned into ticket sellers. By the 1970s, when that very family reunion took place at Vanderbilt University, the process was complete. Billions vanished. Lands were sold off. Railroads went bankrupt and were nationalized or absorbed. Descendants of those who once considered themselves America's royal family moved into ordinary apartments. They started going to work. They started riding the subway. They dissolved into the crowd. The great sale ended. Lots sold. The hall empty. But the Vanderbilt story is not just a story of losing money. It is a lesson that legacy is not measured in square meters of marble. Because, despite the loss of billions, the Vanderbilt name remained. But not at all where they expected to see it. We began this story with Anderson Cooper sitting in the news studio. Now, knowing the path his family took,
from the Commodore's rough ferryboat to the golden cage of Biltmore and Reginald's alcoholic haze, his words about the curse of inheritance sound completely different. This is not the coquetry of a rich man. This is the hard-earned truth of a survivor. Anderson Cooper and his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, became those who broke the vicious circle. Gloria, that very girl whose trust fund was depleted by her alcoholic father and greedy mother, did not mourn the lost palaces. She did what her ancestors had forgotten how to do. She started working. She created an empire of designer jeans, earning her own millions, not on rent, not on clipping coupons, but on a real product. She told her son, "Money you earned yourself is freedom. Money given to you for nothing is cocaine. It kills your will." Today, if you look at the list of famous Americans, you will be surprised how many descendants of this dynasty are there. But none of them is an idle aristocrat. Timothy Oliphant, star of Hollywood westerns, is the Commodore's great-great-great-grandson. He plays sheriffs and bandits, earning a living with his face and talent, not a family crest. The paradox of the Vanderbilt history is that everything they built for themselves collapsed or was sold, and that little they built for people lives and thrives. Walk through downtown Manhattan today. Enter Grand Central Terminal. This is a temple of transportation, built with Vanderbilt money and will. Raise your head. You will see the famous celestial ceiling with constellations. Look at the facade. There, high up, stands a bronze statue of Cornelius Vanderbilt. He looks south, down Park Avenue. Every day, 750,000 people pass through this station, more than the population of some countries. This is the living, pulsating heart of New York. The railroad empire vanished, stocks devalued, but the station stands. This is the only asset that truly survived the centuries, because it was created not for one person's vanity, but for the benefit of millions. Let's go to Nashville, Tennessee, Vanderbilt University. Once, the Commodore, yielding to the persuasions of his second young wife, donated $1 million to its founding. For him, it was a trifle, 1% of his fortune. But today, this university is one of the world's most prestigious scientific centers. There, vaccines are developed, books are written, future leaders are trained. The palaces on which his grandson spent hundreds of millions turned into dust or attractions. And that single million invested in education yielded the richest harvest. This is a cruel lesson for any investor. Concrete crumbles, knowledge is immortal. And what about the palaces themselves? Go to Newport, enter the Breakers. Today it is a museum. You can buy a ticket for $30 and walk through those very halls where the Vanderbilts once tried to play kings. But look closely. Now crowds of tourists in shorts and backpacks walk these halls. They touch the railings. They take selfies against the tapestries. What was created as a symbol of exclusivity and inaccessibility became public domain. The Gilded Age wanted to fence itself off from the people with high walls. The irony is that now these walls exist only thanks to the money of that very people buying entrance tickets. Without tourists, the roof of the Breakers would collapse in a year. The Vanderbilt story is a perfect illustration of the law of conservation of energy in economics. $200 billion, in modern equivalent, did not disappear into nowhere. They were redistributed. They went to architects, jewelers, tailors, winemakers, and ultimately to the state through taxes. The Vanderbilts, unwittingly, financed the U.S. economy. They were a giant pump that sucked money from industry and dispersed it back into society through luxury. They burned $200 billion in one generation. This is the world record for financial suicide. But perhaps in this fall, there is its own greatness. Anderson Cooper once said that he feels incredible lightness from having nothing to lose. He doesn't need to guard ruins. He doesn't need to live up to ghosts. When the last cent from the Commodore's inheritance was spent, the family finally became free. The curse ended when the money ran out. Let's return to the beginning. 1810, Staten Island. A 16-year-old boy borrows $100 from his mother to buy a boat. He has nothing except anger, ambition, and calloused hands. He looks at New York Harbor and sees gold there. He will spend his life to amass the biggest mountain of money in the world. He will think that he is building a pyramid that will stand forever. But he did not know that he was building it on the sand of human weaknesses. 150 years will pass, and in the place of his main palace, a department store will stand, where they sell other people's dreams. And his great-great-great-grandson will look into the camera and report news of other people's wars, earning his bread with his own voice. The circle closed. $100 turned into $200 billion, and then back to zero. The story of the Vanderbilt dynasty teaches us one simple but frightening truth. Wealth is not a number in an account. Wealth is what remains when the money runs out. The Vanderbilts were left only with names on the pediments of buildings they no longer own. And perhaps, looking at their fate, we should not envy their rise, but breathe a sigh of relief looking at their fall. Because the price they paid for their gilded age turned out to be too high, even for the richest people in history.